On a recent weekday night, Matt Taibbi and I went to the Mark Twain House and spoke in front of a live audience. We had a conversation about American politics and about the Eric Garner case, which he's written a book about. And we're providing that conversation, most of it anyway, for you. I look at people, this is the second event like this that I've been to recently, and people look really tense. Do you all feel kind of tense and a little bit crazy and like it's kind of hard to relax and enjoy yourselves? Yeah. And I feel like, right after the election, I was lucky enough to interview John Cleese, of all people. And so John Cleese, one thing I hadn't known about him is he co-wrote some books with this British psychiatrist. And so he said to me, that this guy had said something to him. What he said was, when you're dealing with someone who's mad, you start to feel as though you're mad. And I feel like that. I feel like we're all feeling very crazy these days.
Absolutely. We've all been sucked into this orbit of, there's a logic or an illogic that starts to swirl around Trump. And I noticed this early on just following the guy around in the press corps. Like the press corps started to behave oddly around Trump very early on in the process. And I think we've been in this sort of vortex of insanity where we're being bombarded by this or that crazy news story. Every 5 minutes it's something new. And it's put everybody on edge. I think it's impossible to have a rational take on things after a while. And it's become a very difficult time to really consume the news and not be deeply troubled by it, I think.
Right, because the early arguments were about these really fairly early, easily discernible factual questions. So, for example, NBC and everybody else would say, well, there were 4,000 people at this rally. And he would say there were 12,000 people at this rally.
Right.
And they would say, well, no, that's just impossible. The hall doesn't even hold 12,000 people, and there were empty seats and blah, blah, blah. And there were 4,000. And he would say there were 12,000. And then he would attack the reporters at the next rally, right?
Yeah. Oh, it was amazing. There's a thing that this reporter I met in Iowa was joking about. He calls it the seal of death. And this is this thing that, does everyone remember Howard Dean's Scream? Mm-hmm. Or the monkey business picture with Gary Hart. There's a thing that happens with reporters when a candidate sort of screws up, we bombard them with negative press, and there's like a whole script that we're accustomed to now. There's the abashed public apology, then they disappear for a while, then like 3 weeks later they bow out of the race. And so we tried to do the seal of death on Trump about 50 different times. And every time we tried it just completely backfired. I mean, the first time I watched was after the comments about John McCain, mm-hmm. when, I like people who weren't captured. And when reporters started confronting him about it, Trump did this amazing thing. Like, not only did he not bend his head and apologize the way candidates typically do in the face of all this media scrutiny, he just denied that he said it. And people were looking at each other saying, well, you're on videotape. Like, it's not like it's disprovable. And he did that, but Trump was gambling that the press was less popular than he was, and he was right about that. And it became a kind of odd popularity contest, and the seal of death didn't work.
Right. And, I've been thinking, I actually been reading Katie Tour's book about this, about covering the campaign and about being Katie Tour on the campaign. And it's actually better than you might think, this book. But I mean, one of the things I'd sort of forgotten about is the degree to which he would make specific reporters the focus of his rage at the rallies, where he would say, that's Katie Tour right there. That's little Katie. She's a third-rate journalist. She's a big liar. And either 4,000 or 12,000 people would turn their heads at Katie Tour and start screaming and yelling. And I mean, really, the level of PTSD for some of these beat reporters who covered 510 straight days of this.
Oh, it was. I watched that whole process evolve, and I watched him almost like a comedian trying out material. He tested the boundaries of that tactic. I was at I can't remember the name of the college. It was in northern New Hampshire, and Trump. It was after the debate confrontation with Rubio, mm-hmm. and Trump was sort of hot. Yeah, one of them. And so all these reporters dragged themselves up to sort of listen to what Trump had to say, because it was clear at that point that he was going to win the nomination. And typically reporters stand in the middle of the event hall, and they're surrounded by ropes, and we're sort of on a riser, and we look like a display of desserts, in a restaurant or something like that. Completely ridiculous. And Trump starts pointing at us and saying, look at these bloodsuckers, they've never come so far. They never thought I would make it this far. And we were in the middle of a, pretty, I would say it was between 4 and 12,000 people. And they turned to us, and suddenly, we're in a circle of just angry faces that are hissing and, throwing bits of paper at us. And I thought it was brilliant, actually, because here's Donald Trump. He's a billionaire from New York who's probably never interacted with a regular person in his life. But we solved his accessibility problem by, he sort of made us the hated upper class coastal enemy. And we were up on this rise and we looked unnatural. We couldn't speak. We were dressed in gingham shirts and looked like geeks. And Trump came across as the regular guy, and it was a brilliant tactic, and it worked well for him. And it allowed him to really unnerve a lot of reporters too.
I don't know. Did you have this where I was talking to people, and one thing that I asked them was like, "Who else do you like?" And they said Bernie, and they had the whole Republican field left. Nobody had dropped yet, and they said Bernie. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I got that a lot. It was something I noticed. I've known Bernie for quite a long time. I did a story with him about 12 years ago where he let me tag along with him in Congress for a month. And so I got to know him very well. And going into the campaign, I actually didn't think that he had much of a chance to do much of anything, and I was completely wrong about that. But then the experience of talking to people on the Republican side of the trail and hearing people say to me things like, yeah, he's a socialist, but I believe him, or he's not one of them. Like the first question people would have, the first criteria they would apply to almost everybody was, is this person a politician or not? And Bernie was sufficiently sort of outside what they considered to be a conventional big party politician that they liked him in a way. And that was odd, but it was striking. It was striking early. They preferred him to somebody like Jeb Bush, for instance.
Right. Well, I mean, I think they were ranking people in the order in which they appeared to be willing to burn it all down.
Yeah. There was definitely that. A lot of people that I talked to talked about the influence of money. That was a question that would come up a lot. It was a question that Trump very early on learned to talk about a lot. So, for instance, with Jeb Bush, he couldn't stop talking. He just loved talking about Jeb Bush, and Bush never knew how to respond to it, and it was always a winner for Trump. And he would say things like, "Do you think Jeb Bush is going to do anything to lower your pharmaceutical prices? He's got Woody Johnson, the head of Johnson and Johnson, as his campaign finance chairman. And of course Donald Trump's not going to do anything either. But this stuff really resonated with Trump's audiences, and he would constantly pump up Bernie." During his speeches, he would say, "Oh, the people on the other side are just the same. Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, they're the same. They're bought off the same way. Bernie's different." So I think that had an impact as well.
I have to tell you a real quick story. I'm teaching this class this semester, and Jeb came and talked to us for 2 hours. At one point, I'm making this very Taibbian point about parts of the media. And I said, when you really look at NBC in particular, they're so vertically integrated to be able to deal with a situation like this and just not be able to place a losing bet, no matter what bet they put down. They've got the evening news, and they've got Meet the Press, and they've got Seth Meyers, and they've got Saturday Night Live, and they've got Jimmy Fallon, and Chuck Todd on Meet the Press could take clips from Saturday Night Live and play those. And I was just listening through all these things, and I said, and I think they also broadcast The Apprentice, and I believe they even own Access Hollywood and of the famous tape. And Jeb jumped in and goes, "Well, yeah, I know that's true because of my cousin." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I didn't even think about that." I started bringing it up. He goes, "Oh, that's okay. He got a $4 million settlement." And I thought, oh, it's worse than I thought.
That's unbelievable.
Let's go back to the money, because this is something that you've been writing about for years. You invented the vampire squid, or at least you invented that trope. It's not your fault we have vampire squids.
That's right. Yeah, they existed before.
Right.
Yeah.
But this seemed to be the first time, in a way, that a large audience tuned into that question. I mean, they tuned into it in a very weird way.
They did, and I was deeply shocked to run into a lot of people who in Trump crowds who had read my articles, and they would point to me and say, how can you be against Donald Trump? You're the guy who wrote about Goldman Sachs. And there's just no way to answer somebody like that. I think the devastation of the 2008 crash, the failure to properly address it, the lack of criminal prosecutions, the relative inattention to the destruction that it caused the economy out there. Trump did really well in places where there were huge like foreclosure fraud problems, like in places like Stockton, California. Like those are places that were hotbeds for Trump. And so, the inability of the kind of either party to really properly deal with the financial crisis was a big thing for Donald Trump, and it was a huge thing for Bernie Sanders, who of course made it the central issue of his campaign. And so, when either of those candidates got up there and said, this person is financed by Goldman Sachs, it did resonate. I mean, of course, the first thing that Donald Trump did when he got into office was bring 6 people from Goldman Sachs into his White House. So, it was completely ridiculous. But as a candidate, that was very effective.
I'm looking at your faces, and you still look really tense and worried. And I so get that. And I feel as though we are crazy these days, that you must find this too, that something that might have been a mild disagreement that you might have had with a reader or a stakeholder of some kind, it just flares up in a different way these days.
Yeah, there's an anger and a vitriol
at each other. I mean,
at each other, yeah, that is different. I was talking about this with a fellow journalist friend today, talking about how early in the campaign there was still this kind of, before it became a reality that Trump was going to be the nominee, and there was still a lot of humor in the early part of the campaign. It was very funny. For first there was the whole clown car thing with the 16 candidates who were all tripping over each other. And then there was Ben Carson talking about pyramids being, warehouses to store grain. And, he was doubling down on that. And he was apologizing for having not stabbed somebody. And it was, there were headlines where you couldn't tell whether it was The Onion or New York Times or they'd be identical. And then after Trump won the nomination and it proceeded to the general election, all the humor disappeared. It turned into this just absolute hand-to-hand combat. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that both sides had engaged a lot of trolls on the internet whose job it was to stir up trouble, and maybe, who knows, maybe some of that was the Russian thing, but certainly both the political parties were doing it, and so there was a lot of vitriol, and I don't think it's calmed down since then.
No, and I think there was also, well, first of all, the other thing that I had forgotten was that the Trump campaign was this kind of crap assignment if you were a career journalist in the early stages.
Yeah.
It was like, why are you putting him on the Trump campaign? This is going to be over in 4 months. Why can't I be on one of the really good campaigns that has some chance of lasting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you know the way that campaign trail reporters think, the way to get ahead, one of the big tickets to the big time is signing on early with a winning campaign, writing the book about it, selling the movie rights, and then getting the big plum assignments later. So, you wanted to be the person who hooked up with Bill Clinton before Bill Clinton was big.
I want to put that a different way, but
yeah, sorry. Who got assigned to Bill Clinton? For me, Donald Trump was a perfect assignment because, I didn't really care, and I thought he was funny, and it was a deeply comic assignment that really lent itself to the kind of treatment that I wanted to do. But for most people who were covering it, it was really terrible. Additionally, that was because there was a new trend in this campaign, which was that the candidates didn't travel with the reporters anymore. Trump and then later Hillary Clinton pioneered this new tactic of the press and the candidates and their staff being completely separate. Trump actually had the press riding in a separate plane, so the only people we ever saw were stewards and stewardesses. And there was no interaction at all with the candidate. But early on it was a drag of an assignment, and then it gradually turned into like the most incredible, crazy thing ever.
Do you remember what did you do on the Wednesday after Election Day? Do you remember anything about that day? Interesting day for a lot of us.
Yeah, I'm going to assume it probably had something to do with sleep and downers. But I was shocked. I mean, I went to, because early on in the campaign, I was a firm believer actually in the chances of Donald Trump. I don't mean that in a positive sense. It's just that as a prognosticator, as a gambler, and every reporter who covers campaigns bets on this stuff. It's like a part of our nature. I publicly bet in August of 2015 that Trump would win the nomination. And then I wrote a feature in, I think, February of 2016 where I talked. I really believe that he had a good chance of beating Hillary Clinton. And then during the conventions, at the Republican convention, oddly enough, I got sat down by some Democratic Party operatives who basically wrote down for me and laid out the math of how it was basically numerically impossible for Trump to win. And I was completely convinced by the poll numbers. And it was a huge lesson for all of us reporters that, because if you didn't know about the polls and you just went by what you saw out there, you would think that Trump was in good shape, because every time you left the city limits, you only saw Trump signs. The crowds were massive. The enthusiasm was huge. But I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. I was completely surprised. I don't know about you, but by the results.
I was teaching at that time at Trinity, and my class was with me on election night. And around 11 o'clock, I said, tomorrow, go to the bursar's office and get your money back, get your tuition back, because the person who's teaching this class does not know what he's talking about. And then, as my staff, who's there, my producers are up there, will tell you, 2 days later, I got sick. Like, I got really sick. Like sick for like 2 weeks. I had a 104 fever that wouldn't go away, and I was totally somatic. I knew what was happening. I was somaticizing that feeling too. We do this a long time, and I've certainly had election nights, here in Connecticut where Chris Murphy won by 5 more points than I thought he would, or something like that. This was just so different.
Oh, yeah.
I had no handle on this at all.
No, and it came completely out of left field, and we weren't ready for it. And again, I just can't stress enough that it really underscored to me a huge weakness in how we cover presidential campaigns. The campaign trail is a flying bubble where reporters fly around with each other and with the staffers from the campaigns and with the candidates, and we only talk to each other for months and months on end. We may cover 50,000 miles or 100,000 miles and hit every city in the lower 48, but you won't actually see or talk to people long enough to really take the temperature of what's going on out there. And it's a bubble, and I think this was the ultimate example of how we get caught up in our own conventional wisdom about things. And even people who are prone to, who are inclined to doubt conventional wisdom, like I like to think I am, I got caught up in it, and I was blindsided by it, and I think it's a mistake that we should never make again.
But we probably will.
We will, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I want to ask you one more question about this, and then I want to segue over to I Can't Breathe. You kind of alluded to this already, but it's sort of the question that I struggle with it almost on a daily basis, and it's basically the question of crazy or crazy like a fox, stupid or, and I really vacillate on this. There are times when I think he knows exactly what he's doing,
right,
and then there are times where I think he has no idea what he's doing.
Right, right, yeah. It's a very, very difficult question, and it's the question about Donald Trump, because on the one hand, it's more reassuring if he's
Which one's more reassuring?
Yeah, no, I think the scenario where he has some self-awareness about what he's doing is slightly more reassuring. But, I don't know. It's hard to say.
The Romanovs had some idea what they were doing. They weren't nice.
True. That's true. That's true. I think what I would say is Trump, from watching him, it was abundantly clear that he's incapable of following any kind of strategy for any length of time. For the very brief time that they were able to keep him sort of shellacked to a strategy, and there was a sort of window in August of 2016 when Bannon first came aboard the campaign. Trump read from prepared remarks, which is something that, according to one of his first biographers, Wayne Barrett, he hadn't done ever in his life until his father's funeral. But they did manage to get him on a strategy just for a couple of weeks there when he was, remember that crazy tour where he talked about how he was going to save the African American community? He basically toured America talking to the whitest crowds that he could possibly find. It was like, the Iowa State Fair and all these places. And it was these speeches that were designed to talk about how he was going to revive America's inner cities. And we all thought it was insane, but it actually saved the election for him, because the idea behind it was to convince Republicans who were ashamed of voting for Trump because he was too racist, that it was intellectually acceptable to vote for him, and that he rallied back in the polls from there. But apart from that one stretch, I just see Trump as somebody who's just not capable of really formulating any kind of long-term plan. He just sort of drifts from moment to moment, and he may have inklings of strategies, in a given situation, but he's not able to do it long term, and certainly not on his own.
Right. He doesn't really bridge well from inkling to inkling.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
They're all isolated inklings.
Right.
Okay, we're going to take a break right now. We're live from the Mark Twain house, and we've got Matt Taibbi. We'll be right back. This conversation took place earlier in April at the Mark Twain House. It's me, it's Matt Taibbi, the iconoclastic Rolling Stone journalist. We're talking about American politics, and we're talking about the Eric Garner case, and this is an edited version of what we said. Maybe just to begin, this particular story, the story of Eric Garner, why this story, what drew you to it?
So even it was interesting. The book that I had written before Insane Clown President was called The Divide. It was a big book about sort of the difference between how the criminal justice system works for white-collar criminals versus how it works in inner cities. So I had just begun learning about things like broken windows policing. I was interested in that topic. I wanted to explore it a little more. And when the Garner case happened, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the Eric Garner story, the man who was choked to death in Staten Island and said, "I can't breathe" 11 times. But I didn't plan to write a book about it until I went out there. I went out there the day after the grand jury decided not to indict Officer Pantaleo, and I started talking to people who were sort of sitting on the spot where Garner used to work. And I had a vague idea about writing an article. And instead of talking about the case or the police or how they felt about the verdict or anything, all of Garner's friends just wanted to tell funny stories about Eric Garner. They pointed across the street to this Domino's pizza place, and they were like, Eric Garner would walk into that Domino's pizza place, and he would walk out with a whole pizza, open up the box, fold down in half, and eat it like a taco, right? And it was like one story like that after another, and there was no talk about police or anything. And I gradually got this picture of this guy who was an incredibly interesting, odd, funny, multi-layered, entrepreneurial personality who was completely different from the way he was portrayed in the press. And Mark Twain has once said that the key to fiction is that you have to care something for the characters. You have to care whether they live or die. Twain added that, unfortunately, at the end of most books, you want them all to burn in hell together. But I just found myself liking Eric Garner, and so I just felt like leaving all the issues behind and sort of following around the sort of memories of who this person was and what was going on in his life at the time when he was killed, and decided sort of vaguely to build a book around that. And it turns out that there's this whole vortex of stuff that was going on around this person's life that included hundreds of years of history of, the worst kind of policing techniques, which are just, reinvented under different names now in America. But that was the genesis of the story, was that Garner was this incredibly interesting, complex, funny character who I was really drawn to and really liked. And I thought, it's kind of a weakness of our media these days that we consume everything in these little tiny sort of pre-commoditized bits, and we never get to know any of the people. And I thought I would do it sort of backwards, like get to know the person first and then figure out what it meant later.
Right. I until reading the book, I had no idea who this man was. I only knew the fact pattern that had dominated the headlines of the story. And so on the one hand, he was a troubled and troubling man in lots of ways, and troubling to his own family, but even his mathematical abilities.
Yeah.
You want to say a word too? I mean, this will just give you an example anyway of what you find out.
So yeah, Garner, has anyone here ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Well, there's a character who was close to Malcolm X in his Harlem days named West Indian Archie, who was a numbers guy. And he never wrote down numbers because he could keep them all in his head. And it became a major sort of plot device in the book because Archie and Malcolm X had a falling out over a misremembered number. But Eric Garner was very much like West Indian Archie. He could remember any set of numbers in his head. He would show up on your doorstep 5 years later and tell you that you owed him 73 cents. Like he remembered that. And he had a mania for sports statistics. He knew literally every last statistic about the New York Giants, and to the point where the guys on the block used to wind him up about it. Like they would walk past him and say, "Man, Tiki Barber had a bad year last year with only 605 rushing yards." And Garner would, like, it would be just loud enough for Garner to hear, and he would go rushing after them and be like, "He had 1,118 rushing yards last year." And so they it was like that. But he was able to do all these complex calculations in his head. He had a pretty good business going. He had 6 or 7 employees. He had mules running back and forth to Virginia, buying cigarettes for $5 a pack, and he was just interesting that way. Yeah, I mean, he in a different situation, he could have been something else.
One of the things that you're really good at, although I don't know that you necessarily make a lot of friends doing it, is confronting us with whatever level of involvement or culpability we have in these stories that seem very distant from us. And reading your book, I think it's really true, including Donald Trump, that I have never in my life dealt with a politician I found more repellent and reptilian than Rudy Giuliani. On the other hand, I like walking around New York City and not dealing with all kinds of problems.
Right.
You talk about how in Staten Island there's this development called The Point with an
Right.
E at the end.
With an
Can
E.
you talk a little bit about that? I mean, to what degree are we really good at isolating ourselves or versions of ourselves from these stories?
So the kind of policing that ended up killing Eric Garner and a lot of other young men, particularly in cities. Sometimes it was called broken windows policing, but very often it was marketed with these very innocuous sounding names like community policing. In some cities, they would use a harsher sounding term like zero tolerance policing, but very often it was community policing. And the image that people got was, oh, it's cops on the beat. They're going to be out in the street meeting people and getting to know the neighborhoods, and that's good. So let's vote for that. And so people would vote in all these politicians who promised to do community policing. But when you actually pulled the veil back on what community policing was, it was this unbelievably intrusive, completely unconstitutional program where police would basically stop en masse, basically all young black men of between the ages of 15 and 25, and put them up against the wall and pat them down and take stuff out of their pockets. And white residents of most of these cities had no clue that this was going on. I mean, I lived in New York and have never once been stopped in a stop and frisk. But you can go to neighborhoods in Bed-Stuy or in Stapleton or in places in Staten Island, and it's not hard to find people who've been stopped 15, 20, 25 times, who've been knocked off their bicycle, who've had their book bags dumped on the sidewalk, who've had their money taken out of their pockets. I mean, one of the things that the police did frequently to Eric Garner is they would stop him at any time of the day. He might be, on the way to the laundromat, on the way to the supermarket, and they would pull him out of his car and they would reach into his pocket, take his money and say, "Come down to the precinct and prove that you made it legally and you can have it back." And they would do it to him over and over and over again. Of course, he couldn't do it. And then, that would happen in conjunction with the next day he would go out in the street and he would get robbed by gangs. And he didn't differentiate. To him, it was exactly the same thing, whether it was the police or the Bloods. It was just one gang or the other. And so I guess the point I was trying to make was there are a lot of sort of upscale white urban voters who live in neighborhoods where, that look to be a little less troublesome than they used to, and you don't know what's behind that, but you probably voted for it. And a lot of people maybe don't want to know what they voted for exactly, but this is what they voted for.
Yeah, I mean, we had an incident, many of you remember, just not too long ago, here in the West End of Hartford, where our West Hartford cop had been told that there was an African-American man going door to door, offering to shovel driveways and walks, which turns out to be against the law. In West Hartford, there's a law. If you don't have some kind of permit or whatever, you can't do that. And so a cop was driving around looking for him, drove over the city line, ran into Doug Glanville, who's a former Major League Baseball player and a really terrific and wonderful person who lives in the West End. And the cops sort of said, "Are you out making money, shoveling snow?" And Doug said, "No, I live here. This is my house. I'm shoveling." And it kind of turned into an incident. But I thought the part that we left out was, who really sent that cop over there? Well, by implication, we did.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the
Exactly.
people of West Hartford have this rule, and that involves essentially not wanting unknown identified African American men walking around in their neighborhoods.
Right.
They want some cop to go check that out.
Right. And dating back hundreds of years in America, we've always had these laws that that give police the power to sort of arrest black people whenever they feel like it. Today it might be called obstructing pedestrian traffic or disorderly conduct or refusal to obey a lawful police order. Back in the 1920s, it might have been called vagrancy. In 1865, it might have been called impudence. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a legally meaningless kind of offense that is a catch-all device that police can use to sort of just move people from one place to another. And Eric Garner very much got caught up in that because he worked in this park that was full of sort of junkies and alcoholics. And there were a lot of genuinely dangerous people who hang out in that park, trust me. I spent a lot of time there. But the police didn't go after those people. They went after Eric Garner because he was the biggest person there. He was very slovenly in appearance. He actually had a kind of phobia about buying himself clothes because he wanted all of his money to go to his kids. So he would literally wear his jeans until they fell off his body. And so he was very conspicuous. And if you know anything about how this thing called Comstat works in New York, the sort of police commanders will show pictures of certain blocks to the local precinct captains and say, we want you to clean up this block. We want you to get that guy off the block. And that's how Eric Garner got killed. Basically, a lieutenant drove by in the morning, saw Garner on the block, told a couple of detectives to go back and pick him up. And it had nothing to do with selling cigarettes. He wasn't selling cigarettes that day, as it turned out. He was sick. Probably somebody downtown got an earful from some, captain or major in the police department, and that's what led to Eric Garner having to be picked up by these two meatheads who felt like they had to get him into a police car.
I mean, one thing I want to say about this book, I didn't want to read this book. I don't want to have to deal with things like this. I can't watch the Philando Castile stuff. It's so painful, it makes me sick to my stomach that it happens in America. But once I started reading this book, you do such a wonderful job of kind of fleshing out everybody that it really is just, once I got over my phobia. But I think a lot of us have it, we don't want to deal with this,
right. I knew that it was going to be kind of a problem for readers, that this is a deeply unpleasant subject. It's an awkward subject, particularly for white readers. It's like, how do I feel about this? Do I have culpability for this? Do I really want to get into this? And I thought that the way around that was to get people invested just in who Eric Garner was, and that's why I spent most of the first half of the book just sort of explaining who this person was, what his relationships were, what was going through his mind. He was really an interesting character, flawed in a lot of ways. And as soon as I made the decision to do this project, I also made the decision that I wouldn't watch the whole video of the death scene until I had to actually write that. So I actually didn't see it. I only saw little clips of it, as any casual newsreader would. And I didn't watch it until I had researched Eric Garner's life, probably for almost 2 years. So by that time, it was very emotionally affecting, and that was sort of what I was hoping would happen with readers in this book, is that you would forget, over the course of the first half of the book, what happens in the end, and just be so in the moment of what's his day-to-day kind of problems navigating the street. And there are so many things that he deals with on a day-to-day basis. but you can kind of see it coming too. I mean, it was like a crescendo of problems.
Boy, now they really look tense. And we're really gonna, I feel like what we need as a nation, like we need like the entire United States of America to go to Kripalu or something, or like some place, or I know I'm thinking more like or Canyon Ranch or something, someplace where people can kind of get massages and get a little body work done, kind of work on their breathing a little bit. Speaking of breathing, and got to be because everybody's just kind of holding their breath right now. I mean, you can even feel it in this room. Well, so we're taking a little break right now. We'll be back with one more segment here. Matt Taibbi is here with us. We're at the Twain House. We've got a great audience here. My producers, Jonathan McNichol and Betsy Kaplan, came out into the field to record this show at the Twain House. Jonathan's been editing it, so thanks very much to them. Amanda Fish didn't really do very much. The part of Bill Curry was played by Charlie Pierce. On our next show, The Nose, we'll be talking about the movie that was made about the New London Kilo case, Little Pink House. And right now, we're going right back to me and Matt Taibbi. All right, who we got over here?
Hi, how are you? I guess one of my big concerns these days is the assault on the press and on what's factual or what's true and the so-called alternate truth. I guess my question would be, where do you see this assault on the truth and facts going, and how do you see this playing out? Do you have any idea where we're headed here?
I wrote a book 10 years ago called The Great Derangement, which talked about this phenomenon, talked about how the media was becoming atomized and was becoming a place where people could go onto the internet and sort of go reality shopping. Instead of everybody sitting around the same three channels, which of course was a hugely flawed system, don't get me wrong, but we had a debated set of facts once upon a time. And I don't want to be one of these people who says everything was better in the good old days. But nowadays, especially with sites like Facebook, which have AI-powered algorithms that are designed to feed you news that they know that you're going to agree with. Basically, people all day long are in their own personal echo chamber. It's a social validation feedback loop that they're stuck in. And I don't know what the answer to that is, especially since information is now so much more concentrated than it ever has been before. And you're right, it's a very serious problem.
Okay, so we know that that's the case. So one of the things that legacy or mainstream media has tried to do, maybe in response to this, is diversify their opinion group. So you get the New York Times, and they bring in Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss. You've got the now misbegotten attempt of the Atlantic to bring in Kevin Williamson, and so we know how that turned out. But you see what they're trying to do too. They're sort of saying, well, okay, so if you have this confirmation bias machine over there on social media, we'll get a lot of different voices in here. That's got to be good. How do you react to that?
I think that's phony diversity, frankly. I think what you get in the news landscape is one of two choices. Basically, it's Coke or Pepsi. It's you either get the conservative or the other thing, right? And I would love to see someone like Mark Twain, who hated all politicians equally and had a cynical view towards entire processes, who looked at when parties agree and wondered about that being more dangerous than the times when they disagreed. Those voices are the ones that tend to be excluded. And to your point, there's a Bret Stephens in the New York Times. There are conservative columnists in the Washington Post, which is a very heavily pro-democratic paper nowadays, but they still have Megan McArdle. But there are basically no sort of Sanders Democrats anywhere in the punditocracy nowadays. And that's just the third point of view. I think there should be far more diversity. There should be lots of different kinds of people who look at things in lots of different ways, as opposed to just being on one team or another, which I think is a false presentation of reality and is part of the reason that people are so decamped now. They just feel like that they either have to be on one side or the other and constantly arguing with each other.
Okay, more questions.
Do you have any an honest insight into the international perception of America now, and how is that changing? How is the honestly, is it viewed as a sort of momentary weird time, or is the sort of position of leadership drastically changing, and if so, toward what?
So I have a couple of perspectives on this. One, I lived overseas for 12 years. I spent most of my 20s and early 30s in Russia. When I first went overseas in 1990, Americans were worshipped. You could go in, if you held up your blue passport, people would flock around you. They'd want to like lay hands on you like you were a religious figure. They thought we had all the answers to everything. By the time I left Russia in 2002, we were, like a notch above child molester in the estimation of most people who lived in Russia because of the neoliberal policies that we had exported to that country. Now, people feel like the election of Trump, from what I hear, and I only get this through talking to foreign reporters for the most part, but people feel like the election of Trump confirms every negative thing that they ever believed about America, which is that we're a society that doesn't read, doesn't think, likes to solve its problems through force, only values money, doesn't care about its poor, is racist and xenophobic, and is completely ignorant about the rest of the world. And to boot, is incredibly dangerous and doesn't understand or respect its own destructive power around the world. And I think it's not just Trump's election that has done this, it's decades and decades and decades of misbehavior, of illegality, of the sort of policies where we just decide to bomb countries without having debates in Congress. We bombed in Obama's last year in office. We dropped 26,000 bombs in 7 different countries in Obama's last year in office. And did you ever hear about it? I mean, I didn't hear about it. But people around the world hear about it for sure. And Trump has already escalated. He's already dropped more bombs total than Obama did in his entire 8 years. And Obama dumped 10 times as many bombs as Bush did in his drone program. So America around the world, we're the guys with the black hats. We're crazy, stupid, and dangerous, and people fear us.
That might not be the right note to send them out of the building on. But so what I'm going to say is, before we give this man a tremendous round of applause, to which he is absolutely entitled. No, before you do that, I want you to all take a deep cleansing breath. All right? You didn't do it. I saw you didn't do it. Let it out. Okay, now a big round of applause for Mr. Matt Taibbi.
Thank you. Thank you so much.